Another study update. I've been reading Schwabel still. I've read Jensen's account and Zazula's chapter, and now I'm back to a chapter by Schwabel on Christology and Trinitarian thought. And I keep finding with these thinkers from the 80s to the 2000s that there's a great deal of confusion and obscurity and almost a rejoicing in false dichotomy, or asking what seems to me, from my perspective, silly questions. So questions like, should Christological reflection proceed from Christology to soteriology, or from soteriology to Christology? And what Schwabel does in his chapter is present a number of antinomies, is what he calls them, between like the Jesus of faith, the Jesus of history, meaning and being, using all these kind of buzzwords. But generally, it results in unclarity and confusion. And it just seems to be my staunch belief that modern theology generally, from Bultmann to Pannenberg, though I think Pannenberg is more along the right track than Bultmann, just seems to me that modern theology gets off on totally the wrong foot. Theology, Reformed theology in America at the turn of the 20th century seems much more respectful, commonsensical than the stuff that's being raised by these kind of German European theologians at the same time. And I just find that for the most part, what's happening in European theology from the 80s to the 2000s in terms of Trinitarianism, though there is some good stuff there, is generally misguided. It conflates different propositions. It makes odd generalizations, like what he just said. Should Christological reflection proceed from Christology to soteriology, or from soteriology to Christology? And just like the kind of distinction between doing theology from above and from below, it's folly. I think Lash said something like this. It's folly to think you can do theology without giving due regard to either. It's a kind of false dichotomy. And I guess in my head, beginning with the biblical revelation of who Jesus is will entail that we do justice to both. I think part of the problem with modern theology is its treatment of the biblical revelation leads to all these difficulties that they wouldn't have if they're given due respect to the Bible or the inspiration of Scripture. If we take the Bible seriously as God's special revelation to us, then generally we will do justice to the data of the Christian tradition and Christian revelation. It just seems to make more sense to me that they seem to be constantly trying to simplify things down to kind of short phrases when the reality is much more complex than that. It's just very difficult for me to see modern theology as anything more than kind of indulgent speculation in novelty and cultured ideas. I think I've said it before, G.K. Chesterton was right when he talked about how the common sense answer is usually the best. The person in the pew is usually right. I think generally it will just be a case of figuring out why they're right, rather than making up all kinds of obscure, speculative ad hoc theses. Rather than doing theology for theology's sake, we should just seek to do justice to how God has revealed himself in the Bible and the reality that we experience. There isn't a disjunction between history and what happens today. Like, this idea that we can't say anything meaningful about history, or that certain truths, how do certain contingent truths have universal significance, it just seems misguided. Like, every day things happen that influence the rest of the world. It's just a fairly simple cause and effect kind of thing. Things that happen in the past affect what happens in the future. Since Jesus died, we have the opportunity to know God and enjoy him forever. There's no need to overcomplicate it. So there you go. I just find that a lot of these modern theologians raise more problems than they solve. And I think largely what happens in the 2000s onwards in Trinitarian theology is a reaction to that kind of theology that doesn't really clarify itself. Because especially with the kind of rise of analytic theology, there's this kind of response to these theologians that have been much more obscure, much more continental, and I think that's a really good thing. So with Trinitarian theology, you can begin to see that shift when Karen Kilby brings out her paper on perichoresis and projection. There's a new kind of caution to what people will say, and the need to clarify terms and propositions and arguments. And I think that is very wise and a really good result and development in Trinitarian theology over the last 30 years. That's all I have to say for now. Been quite a long update. I'm going to carry on reading Schroebel, and then, as I said, I'm going to try and read some of the primary texts and get to proper grips with Nicaea and its legacy.